Hello and welcome to another RedLine Solutions webinar in our education series. And thank you to all those joining us on YouTube today. Today we're really excited to be able to take you through an overview of the new Safe Food for Canadians regulations. We're also honoured to have some wonderful presenters here with us. Firstly, we have Jane Proctor, the VP of Policy and Issue Management of the Canadian Produce Marketing Association, and her colleague Jeff Hall, who is the Food Safety Specialist. Last but not least, we also have our very own CEO, Todd Bagger. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Todd.
Thank you, Adrian. And again, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this important webinar, really going over some information that you need to know if you are going to be shipping to Canada, exporting from Canada, or transporting items between provinces. A brief overview of our agenda today is I'll give you a quick overview of who RedLine Solutions is. We'll talk then also about from the Safe Food from Canadians regulations, the licensing requirements, the preventive control regulation requirements, traceability requirements, the Safe Food for Canadian regulation timelines, and also the arrangements that the CFIA has with the US FDA. We'll end the session with a little Q&A. So if you have questions, as Adrian said, go ahead and type them into that chat window at any time, and we will get to those at the end of our session. So just a little bit about RedLine. I started the company back in 1997. Our headquarters are in Santa Clara, California, and we are the leader in packing, inventory, and traceability compliance solutions for produce. I'm an active participant in the PTI Leadership Council, and RedLine as a company has hundreds of customer sites across North America, and you can see some of these green pins here on the map that show you a lot of those sites. We're currently have customers who are handling over 550 million cartons per year. And for the last 3 years running, we've been named as one of the top 100 software and technology providers by the Food Logistics magazine. So what is it that we do? We're systems integrators, and what that means is that we deliver exceptional inventory management and traceability solutions to our customers that focus on cost-effective, increasing productivity, and operational efficiencies. We do provide complete solutions, and what makes us a little unique in this industry is not only do we provide the software and the services to implement that, but we also provide the hardware and then all of the support that goes around that. Our software includes options for on-premise as well as web-based warehouse management and packing solutions specifically designed for produce. We also provide tote, bin, case, and location labeling for our customers as well. Here's a partial list of our customers, and I think the main point that I wanted to get across here is that our customers are across the produce industry in every type of commodity in every region of North America. Our partnerships include some of the leading software providers like Computech and Famous Software, as well as some of the leading hardware providers like Zebra Technologies and Honeywell. We also are a partner with Siegel Scientific, has barcode printing software for very simple applications, and we do all of our development in the Microsoft platform as a Microsoft partner as well. And then lastly, the associations that we're members of include the PMA, the CPMA, Grower Shipper of Central California, the Western Growers, and United Fresh.
So thanks for that, Todd, and let's pass the session over to Jeff Hall.
Okay. So thanks very much, Todd and Adrian, for inviting us on to talk about the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. It's been a long time coming. I think this all started off in around 2012. I think that's when the Act was passed, and it's taken us about 6 years to get to the regulations. But they're here now, and we're happy to share the information with your customers. So I will get started here. I'm going to basically give a general overview of the regulations. without delving into too much of the detail. But Jane is going to take over for the traceability piece and provide a little more information and a little more depth there, because we know it's an area that is on the top of everyone's mind right now for a number of reasons. So, and then when we get to the end, as Todd had mentioned, we're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I'll just get her started here. So, as I mentioned, 2012 was when the Safe Food for Canadians Act was passed into law up here in Canada. In the years between 2012 and 2018, the government has done a relatively good job, and I don't compliment government easily, but they've actually done I think probably about as best a job they could to include industry, to include NGOs, to include the public in drafting these what are now published regulations. You know, obviously our world is the fresh produce, but we always have to keep in mind that the government is dealing with all of the food commodities. And like most regulations, you never get everything you want, but overall, it's certainly a package that we can work with, and we certainly feel like we've had some input on it. The regulations themselves were passed into law through what's called the Canada Gazette Part 2. A little different up here. You guys use a federal registry down in the States. We use Canada Gazette Parts 1 and 2 to get legislation out there. So that was June 13th, 2018, that was passed. The coming into force date for the regulation is actually January 15th, 2019, which isn't that far away. And part of the reason for the staggered coming into force piece has to do with giving stakeholders that have to deal with the regulations, both domestically within Canada here, as well as our international trading partners, some time to take a look at the regulations. If anything glaringly wrong or would cause issues was to jump out, there is then some time to at least get the comments back to the government, and then that will be looked at and addressed through the guidance documents that the government is putting out. We've also heard that the government may be doing a second round of the Safe Food for Canadian regs, just to kind of tie up a few of the loose ends that are out there. So that's another opportunity to possibly get a little more of what we'd like to see in it. But overall, it is what it is, and we can work with it. So this is what we're going to start doing in January. So basically, the SFCR comes down to three major components. There's the licensing component, which is new for a lot of the Canadian food industry. There's preventive controls, which are basically modeled after your basic HACCP and your GFSI types of programs. And then there's the traceability piece, which once again is new to a number of the different food commodity groups. I'm going to start off with licensing here and then get into preventive controls. One of the key things that the regulations were based on as well is the government decided to get away from being prescriptive where possible, and there's always some things that will have to be prescribed, and to more of an outcomes-based system. So basically what the government is saying is that, you know, to be acceptable, this is the end result of whatever process or whatever it is you're doing. So they won't tell you how to get there, but they will tell you what it needs to look like at the end. And then it's really up to individual organizations to figure out how they're going to get there. So on one side, that's great for industry. It really allows folks to be a little more creative and kind of they can think out of the box a little better when it comes to implementing the regulations. Of course, the other side is that they also have to make sure that the outcomes that they do end up with have been gotten through means that are acceptable, both from a public health standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, from a legal standpoint. So it's both sides of that coin, where you know, being given the freedom is great, but then you have to take the responsibility with it. So, but the government is willing to do as much helping in that area as they can. So with respect to licensing, the government has brought in a program whereby all, well, almost all food companies in Canada, including imports and exports, will require a license. This came about, the government realized a number of years ago that there was a fair bit going on within the country that they have very little oversight over, or that they had very little visibility to. So they wanted to make sure that all that was captured as they move forward with the new regulations. One of the key things around licensing has to do with, it's more about what you do than who you are or who you say you are. And some of the key things that will trigger the need for a license are manufacturing, processing, treating, preserving, grading, packaging, labeling of food, slaughtering of food, which I know probably doesn't involve many folks on this particular call, and if you're doing interprovincial trade, and in some cases, if you're doing export. Anyone that is an importer of food will be required to have a license. As I noted, the export community would as well, if they need an export certificate to go along with that, and if you store or handle import any meat products. So that's not really new for the meat folks. What the CFIA licensing is going to do is allow CFIA to identify the businesses that are involved in those activities, and it also allows them to get an idea of what companies are doing in particular, and then when they go into audit companies or when they're looking for information for companies, they have an idea of the specific activities that those companies are involved with. The resources that are available, the CFIA has done quite a good job of putting a number of resources up on their website, and they have one of the key things they've put in for both the licensing and preventive controls and traceability is an interactive tool, which basically asks you a series of questions, walks you through to the answer, and it will let you know in licensing, for example, whether or not, you know, what you've put in would require a license or not. And it also links directly to the guidance document and the timelines for implementation that are there. So it is useful when it comes to identifying whether or not you're going to need a license and where to get some of the information on that. So some licensing specifically to the fresh fruit and vegetable world. The license will be required by January 15th of 2019 for all people who grade, package, repackage, label fresh produce, treat, or minimally process, like the fresh cut folks, if you're involved in interprovincial or importing of products. One of the key things about the license is you're going to have to go online to get it. And to get to the license site, excuse me, just a little drink of water there, the government has set up a secondary site that's called MyCFIA, not to be confused with Ask CFIA, which is their portal for asking specific questions to the government. The MyCFIA site is the portal that companies will use whenever they have any kind of what I'll call business interactions with CFIA. So if you need a license, you would go into your MyCFIA account and find the license area, and then make sure you completed the information properly, and they would then issue a license number. The MyCFIA is up and running at this point, so we strongly encourage anyone who's going to need a license to get onto MyCFIA. You can go in and set up your account now, because with a lot of things like this, folks do tend to procrastinate, and it will be the day before. It will be, you know, January 14th, 2019, and everybody and their brother will then try to get onto the MyCFIA site, and it will undoubtedly cause some issues from a software and data handling standpoint. So, and that won't just screw up the folks that are trying to get on. Those will be the folks that are already on and already have their information set up. So we strongly encourage you get onto the MyCFA site and set up your account. The government has not laid out any specific criteria when it comes to licensing, only as it is affected by what you're doing. So that's that grading, packaging, labeling, and whatnot. It really will come down to individual businesses to decide whether they want to license the entire operation under a single license, or maybe it makes sense to have 2 or 3 licenses depending on the activities that take place within your business. One of the things that has been suggested is that if part of your business is a higher risk, possibly, that you may consider licensing that part of the business under a separate license, and with the rest of the business under just a more general license. That way, if in the event that you ever had a problem with a high risk area, you could, it wouldn't affect all of your business. So it is something that before you go in and actually decide on the number of licenses, you need to have a good idea of the business and how you wanted to handle things. One thing that is important there too, it is not required to get a license if you grow or harvest fresh produce. And once again, you don't need a license for exporting unless an export certificate is requested by the country you're sending stuff to. Preventive controls, I'm going to go through fairly quickly here. Preventative controls are basically your HACCP program. Anyone that's working under a GFSI program, be it Primus, be it Canada Gap, those sorts of things, will have most, if not all, of the requirements listed under the preventive control parts of the regulations in place already. These are all based on, like I say, globally recognized HACCP principles. And one of the key things that the government did want to do when drafting the regs was they did not want to basically recreate the wheel. They know there are globally recognized standards out there that have been around for a number of years that are kind of tried and true. And they didn't want to force extra regulations on people, understanding that they already had things in place. As with all pieces of legislation, regardless of the country you're in, certainly the law of the land always takes precedent. So if you are working under a GFSI program, it's important to still understand the preventive controls and all related regulations that affect your business. Then do a review of your program. Make sure that you're covering off all the legal requirements. You may have to add a couple of things here or tweak a couple of things there, but the government is not looking for folks to go out and rewrite what are already excellent food safety and preventive control plans. Once again, this is an area where the CFIA does have an interactive tool, so it's very useful in understanding your preventive controls as well as your preventive control plans. There are some exceptions to the preventative control plans, and that generally deals with smaller organizations that just may not have the internal resources to have a fully written out plan, but they do have to understand the risks involved with their business. They do have to have some records around their preventive controls, but just to try to make it a little less onerous on some of the smaller folks. So as I mentioned earlier, Jane's going to touch on the traceability piece, so I'm just going to jump over that. So this chart here is basically lays out the basic timelines for the SFCR as they relate to the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. I'm not going to obviously go into this in detail. It will be available in the deck that Todd and Adrian send out to you or make available to you. Once again, we always like to say, whenever it comes to this type of information, it really is some guidance for you. we always recommend that people refer back to the regulations themselves, any updates that the government has put up, any guidance material that they put up, because these sorts of things can sometimes change, and your most current information will always be on the government site. Here at CPMA, we're always willing to help out our membership when it comes to new information or providing links and helping them find the answers to their questions. So as members, you're always welcome to reach out to CPMA, and we're more than happy to help you as well. So the next piece I'm going to touch on has to do with an arrangement that is between the CFIA and Health Canada up here and FDA. So back in May of 2016, those three regulatory bodies came into an agreement that they would recognize each other's food safety systems. So it's basically a foreign supplier recognition system for food safety. So in effect, what it means is if an organization is producing food in the U.S., then Canada will recognize that U.S. Food safety system. So if you're working under FDA, and let's say you're working under the produce rule, CFIA recognizes that as providing, and the official way they put it is the same public health outcome. So what it means is, as a U.S. producer, you're not required to comply to the Safe Food for Canadian regulations because you already are compliant with the FDA. In the case of produce, it would be either the produce rule or the processed food for human consumption rules, depending on where your business falls. The opposite is also true, that as a Canadian company working with oversight from CFIA, that the FDA would recognize that as a similar system. They're not exactly the same, and obviously that's always going to happen when you've got different countries, excuse me. But the outcome is the same. The public health outcome is the same. The way it's currently set up is the government in Canada they're in the process of creating a list, basically, of all the companies that are under a CFIA license when they come into effect in January. And basically, if you're on that list, it will indicate whether you are in good standing with the government or not, and that's what the FDA will use to verify a company is in good standing when product is shipping down to the U.S. Obviously, with all kind of government tools that they put in place or programs, we're hoping they're up and running and they have that system in place by January 15th. But quite often there can be delays for whatever reason. But the industry can be assured that CFIA is communicating that with FDA, and they have had assurances from FDA that if there are some delays in that timing, they understand that, and it will not cause any slowdowns or stops of product moving across the border, and it goes in both directions. One of the interesting things about the FDA arrangement, from their point of view, is under the FSMA, it really is the U.S. importer that's required to ensure that whoever they're bringing product in from is working under FSMA. And that's a little different than in Canada, where we do allow for non-registered importers, and they can act as importers into Canada. But once again, that only applies for countries where we have a recognized system with. And in this case, Canada only recognizes the U.S. system. Down in the U.S., I believe it's Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And I heard somebody else was going to be soon. But so you guys have a little more choice when it comes to working under a modified system for FSMA. Okay. So basically, the reason for this arrangement is the governments recognized that they didn't want to put anything in place that would cause a delay of business back and forth across the border. That's not the purpose of the new regulations. So they didn't want to have any issues that way, and they also didn't want to add too much more regulatory burden to companies. One thing that is important if you are a Canadian exporter into the U.S. is that although our system is recognized, there's three pieces that you have to make sure you've got in place as well, which actually kind of sits outside of the Safe Food for Canadian regs. Basically, the three are who's developed your program, your foreign supplier verification program. So that would be the importer in the U.S. would have to make sure they understood that, and who audits that system. So once again, anyone working under a GFSI program would be compliant with that to begin with. How the importer must be identified when product comes in. Once again, that has to do with the DUNS number and making sure that is properly identified on the paperwork. And the last one has to do with maintaining of records. And once again, if you're working under a GFSI program, you're already going to have that in place. But it's always a good idea, as I mentioned earlier, to go back, just check those three points out of the FSMA legislation and make sure you're compliant with them. I've kind of touched on most of this already, so I won't go into this slide in detail. But basically what the arrangement does is it allows Canadian companies to work under the modified foreign supplier verification program, which is, just goes back to that recognition between the two safety regimes in the two countries. So this is just kind of a quick little graphical representation. Basically what this means is that if you are a Canadian company, if you look at the top line and you're shipping into the US, then you have to have a US importer, as it says in white there on the line. You'd have to be compliant and under the oversight of CPMA. That's, of course, the Safe Food for Canadian regs. And then you'd qualify for the modified the MSVP program, and that all has to do with the arrangement there. If you are shipping into the U.S. from any country where the U.S. does not have that systems arrangement, then you're going to have to follow the full FSMA FSVP program. And of course, FSVP, Foreign Supplier Verification Program. I'm not going to go into each one of these in detail. So once again, it just outlines, the way product is moving back and forth across borders. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that's when we get the time. There's a list of resources. They will be made available. And once again, it's a good thing to kind of go in, familiarize yourself with, and there is a lot of good information out there right now. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Jane, and she's going to talk to you about traceability.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Just a quick question for everybody, because we are in one office and we're sharing, we're doing this obviously over speaker on our phone. Can everybody hear okay? And I guess I'll have to ask the organizers, you're probably going to can speak to that.
Yeah, I've got somebody who's logged in and they can hear fine.
They can hear fine. Okay, perfect. Well, then off we go to the rodeo. So good afternoon, good morning, good day to everybody. So Jeff, of course, gone through lots of components of the regulations. I'm going to drill down, as he said, specifically into the traceability components, and we'll just get started. Maybe just to let you know, in terms of my background around traceability, so I've been involved in traceability at a national, bilateral with US and Canada, and international level for many, many, many years. I've was part of the team. I led the industry creation of the global standard for traceability for our sector. Led a Canadian initiative here, and with Todd, of course, CPMA is one of the founding partners, I guess, or sponsors, whatever we want to say, of the Produce Traceability Initiative. So CPMA has a long history of traceability involvement. In terms of the regulations themselves, we were, as Jeff said earlier, we were quite involved in all of the work, the consultations and efforts that led up to the creation of the regulations, specifically around traceability. We worked very closely with government to try and help them understand what is and is not feasible within our sector. There is still a little bit of a blip on that, which I'll talk a little bit later on, but we continue to work very closely with them, and they're very receptive, as has been our experience, I think, in the U.S. also. So we're quite pleased that we finally got to these regulations. A little bit quicker, I guess, than has happened so far in the U.S., but we'll see. The good news is that in most areas, they are completely aligned with PTI. There's nothing that's out of alignment with PTI, the Produce Traceability Initiative. There are, of course, because these are regulations, there are some specifics that we did not specify within the PTI requirements, and so you'll want to familiarize yourself with that, and I'm going to speak to all of it. And I think maybe the only other thing, I guess, is that what I've done in this presentation is I've tried and almost entirely I've taken the regulatory text right out of the regulations so that I'm not misleading you. You'll get the regulations as required. So you're going to see lots of kind of common themes here, almost duplication, because each part, of course, goes into the specifics of the different roles, the different actions, et cetera. So moving along. So just in general, what are the requirements of the traceability regulations? And I'm not going to read through that whole introduction. I suffice to say probably most of you on the call are in that catch-all there. So basically, you have to have the common name of the food, a lot code, or other unique identifier, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later. That enables you basically to trace the food back to where, of course, the product came from, and that includes the name and principal place of business of the person. So, and in this case, I should say all the way through this, when you see the word person, it's not looking for an individual. Person is defined within the Canadian regulations, and not just in these regulations, to include companies. So person, for the purpose of these regulations, is really the company. So nothing surprising there. That's very basic, common requirements within traceability. There are some exceptions. One is if they provide the food to another person as a sale at retail, then they have to know the date in which it was provided, the name and address of the person, but I'll talk about a bit in a minute. That ends at the retail store, or at the back door, I should say, or of the store, or within the retail operation, I guess, a better way of putting it. And of course, if the food was provided to another person, who that person was, name and address, and the name of the commodity. So what was it that was incorporated into the food, or which the food was derived from? And again, the names and addresses of those. So what's important, I think, to notice in this top part here, though, is just a couple of things I'll point out. So it's who imports or exports, if it's conveyed from one province to another, so if it's internal within a province, it's out of scope, and of course, you have to prepare and keep documents. Now, why that's important, particularly if you are a U.S. resident, for example, exporting to Canada, is that while the regulations, of course, will not apply to another country, your buyers are going to have to be compliant with these. And so that's why, of course, I imagine many of you are on the call today. So what are these requirements? So excluding retail, and that's important to note just for this particular one. Again, and as I said, you're going to see lots of duplication here, but you'll see that if it's a food business other than retail, if you're providing that food, you have to have and keep documents that include the common name of the food, the lot unique identifier, the name and principal place of business, et cetera. You have to be able to trace it one step up, one step back, knowing dates on which those activities occurred and who provided it to you. And again, person meaning company. And of course, the same has to happen as you forward to somebody else. So when was the date that you provided it, and the name and the address of the person, read company, to whom you provided it. Just a little note here in terms of what a unique identifier means. So unique identifier, as I think we all know what a lot number is, and it can be, it can be really whatever you want it to be. It can be alphanumeric, et cetera, where things were processed, packed, graded, et cetera. Typically, of course, a lot, that means all under the same conditions. But a unique identifier can be things like a PO number, a bill of lading number. And that's important for retailers because it means that they can get these numbers as a unique identifier to unlock traceability, deeper traceability information, such as lot numbers of specific cases, et cetera. So that kind of is a brief or explanation of unique identifier. This is defined in the regulations, so you can always see it there. Now, if you are a retailer, then of course, unless you're a restaurant or other similar enterprise, you have to do the same things. You have to have the lot number, unique identifier, as I said, name and principal place of business, the common name, and you have to be able to trace one step back. So here's the difference is that if you're in retail, you don't have to trace one step forward. In other words, you don't have to trace to the customer. I want to just point this out to you because there was a lot of angst, and I think continues to be a lot of angst here in Canada about the fact that restaurants are not included in these regulations. And of course, many of you, and maybe all of you, would certainly say, well, that certainly can be a point of contamination or a source of any problems. And we all realize that, as does the government. However, here in Canada, restaurants are outside the mandate of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So they are outside of federal mandate. They are within the provincial and sometimes even down to the municipal level, where the mandates lie in terms of responsibilities and who governs restaurants' requirements or other similar enterprises. Now, I just will say to you that there is a process here in Canada called the FPT, or the Federal, Provincial, Territorial, and then after that it can be on health, on ag, et cetera, et cetera. And these are committees that are made up of just exactly what it says. So the federal government, provincial governments, and of course here in Canada we have territories, so are the territorial governments. Now, what we're all hoping, and the early indicators are that this is what we'll see, is that any big regulation, any big issue is always brought to these, what they call the FPT tables. And very much the expectation is that now that these regulations are out, and throughout the process, because of course the provinces and territories have visibility to these, just as industry did, the hope is that the provinces and territories will embrace these regulations and basically embed them in their provincial regulations. And that is important, of course, if you think about things like the exclusion of restaurants and other similar enterprises right now, because it would mean that they would then have jurisdiction over those businesses. And so that is what we're all waiting to see, and I'd be very surprised if we didn't see something quite similar, if not very similar to these regulations mimicked or embedded in the provincial and territorial regulations. So let's talk a minute then about retention accessibility of traceability documents. So in other words, your record keeping. And I will say, we chatted a little bit just before we started the call with all of you, we being RedLine and CPMA. So the record keeping components, I believe, are quite aligned with the U.S. bioterrorism. Certainly, if you look at this first note here, that the records have to be kept 2 years, after the day in which the food was provided, or you provided food to another person/organization. That, I believe, is completely aligned with U.S. bioterrorism. What's important, of course, and again, some of these things are very intuitive. You'd say, well, of course, they're regulations, but nonetheless, here they are. So if you sell food at retail, you have to have access to the traceback documents for the 2 years in which you sold the food. So it's all about that date when that activity occurred. And they have to be accessible in Canada. Now, do they have to be in Canada? They do not have to be in Canada, but you have to be able to access them, and I'll talk about the timelines in which in the next slide. So that's really important. And note here, if you keep traceability documents electronically, they can be stored on a server outside of Canada, but they must be accessible from locations within Canada. And if you have documents that you're expecting to link to outside Canada, so that unique identifier, for example, if there was an incident and a retailer, a buyer, a wholesaler, whoever had to access a supplier's traceability information that was outside of the country, they still have to do it within the timeframes allotted. But of course, that's where they would then be, the requirement would be that they would be on the phone or on email or whatever to their suppliers outside of Canada to say, I need this information and I need it within 24 hours, as you'll see on the next slide, or potentially even a lesser time frame. So that's why I said to you, even if you're not in Canada, if you don't import in Canada, or you're exporting from Canada, et cetera, but if you are supplying product into Canada, you need to be quite aware of this because your buyers are going to be asking you for this. So we start to see a little bit more prescription, if you will, here in terms of the traceability document availability. So if there was an incident, and of course we all hope every day that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does, they have to be available in English or French, not both, and they have to be available, as I said, within 24 hours of CFIA making that request. Now, if the CFIA believes that there's a risk of injury to human health and that they could stop it within a shorter period of time, they can ask for those records in a shorter period of time. And they could, conversely, they could say, we don't need it within 24 hours, it's a longer period of time if it's not necessary for a recall. But if they might still be looking for information, but they don't feel they need to execute a recall. There is ambiguity here, and there's a lot of leeway here for the government, and we're aware of that. We spent a lot of time talking to them about that during the creation of the regulations, because a shorter period of time implies that it could be anything less than 24 hours. We all have to hope and assume, perhaps we shouldn't, that government would be realistic in terms of a time frame, because we've talked to them a lot, and I'm sure others have, that, you know, if something is required within 24 hours or less, and it's on a weekend, it's on a Friday night, it's in the middle of the night, and maybe the product came from a time zone that's 7, 8, 10, whatever hours away, you start to see the complications of getting it in a shorter period of time. Even 24 hours might be a bit of a challenge. So we're hoping that we will see common sense in that, and I think that's, you know, we haven't seen common sense in the past, so we're hoping we'll continue to see it. And the next bullets, you just talk about what kind of format those documents would have to be in. If you provide them electronically, basically what they're looking for is the government wants to receive the documents in a format in which they can easily incorporate it into their internal systems and have a look at it. So things like spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets, things like this. What they don't want is to see something that's a very proprietary system, and you think you can just extract and send, and it's going to come in what would be an unreadable format for them. So, you know, again, common sense, but nonetheless laid out within the regulations. So labeling requirements, and this is the one area where we might get into just a little bit of a pickle, but we're working on it. So the labeling information that must be provided with the food, and I would just draw your attention to this line. So a label is applied, attached, or accompanies the food. Now that means it doesn't have to necessarily be on the product, but it must accompany the food. Now the reality is that, at least in our industry, the label is going to be on the food. I can't imagine that you would have labels, you know, I don't know, send little plastic bags alongside, but anyways, that's how the regulations are written, and of course they're written for all foods, so that's why there's some leeway there. What information must be on the label? So it must be the common name again, and again you're seeing the common information here: name and principal place of business, and then the lot code if it is a consumer prepackaged food. Now, I want to draw your attention to this because this is fundamentally different than what a lot of people are doing now. And I will tell you that although we worked very closely with CFIA, we were all quite surprised when we saw the final regulations, and this was something brand new that they put in the regulations before anybody had seen it. So we know right now that it is not necessarily common practice within the fresh produce sector. It is apparently in others where they have had regulations to this effect for some time, but within the fresh produce sector, we are not commonly, and there's never been a requirement or any kind of industry initiative or even global standards that have said you must put the information of a lot code on a consumer prepackaged food. We do know that, of course, especially in private label and other areas like this is much more common, but we will be actually executing a survey of our members, and we're going to work with other associations to do the same, to try and determine what the scope and impact of this would be to the industry. Because to this point, of course, and certainly RedLine, and I think many others, anybody working with a PTI format or framework in their solutions and in their businesses, the tracing and information on the label has all been at the case level. So we are continuing to work with the government on that. There are some exceptions. So I'm not going to read it all, but you don't have to have this information depending on your food exports, because of course the CFIA is not going to govern what's required in other jurisdictions. And of course, as with all regulations, with all standards, we always encourage industry to be aware of the requirements within other jurisdictions, and we continue to do the same for Canadian shipping outside the country. Other exemptions in terms of for lot and code and the name and principal place of business. Now, this is important if you are, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, we initially have had this conversation with some others, and there was a lot of angst around this on things like protective wrappers, protective bags, those kinds of things. So you don't have to have the information, the lot number on, if you're doing field packs, for example, and you're overwrapping with a plastic film, if you're using celery seeds, etc. None of those are required. if you're doing that. However, if it's a prepackaged food, for example, something that is in a clamshell, in a bag, etc., then they are required to put the lot number on, as regulations currently state. And of course, if you have wrap or combining bands, you don't have to do either. And of course, not on bulk, thank heavens. So those are some of the exceptions. Oh, there we go. Oops, now I've gone. Oh boy, now I'm gonna have a problem because I don't know how to get back. I just have to.
Right click.
There we go. So the previous. Whoops. There we go. Previous. Oh, there we go. Okay, so again, some exemptions in terms of the common name. You can read through these, but they're very specific to, for example, fresh apples, so that when they're packaged, so the variety name is shown on the label. Prepackaged fruits or vegetables that are visible and identifiable in their container, so you wouldn't have to have the common name on, etc. Again, product is packed in protective wrapper. So this is only for the common name, not for the lot. There we go. And again, for name, principal, place of business, exceptions to having that is, again, prepackaged fruits or vegetables that are visible and identifiable in the container. And these are all things, by the way, that were in earlier regulations for labeling. So some of this is not new. And you are not, if that is the situation, if those are your products, you don't have to have the name and principal, place of business on the container. So just to wrap up in terms of what we're doing, as I said, we're in discussion now with CFIA about this requirement for lot on consumer prepacks. And we've committed to them that we will try and give them a sense of the impact. So if you are on the phone, if you are a member of ours or Rebecca Horticultural Council and you see this survey, please take a few minutes and reply to it, because if we don't have good data, we will not be able to make the case with CFIA that this should be an exemption for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. So right now we're hopeful, but it's going to depend on what we get from the industry. And just to wrap up really quickly, 2 more slides. One is, Jeff talked about the activities and timelines. He talked about some of the other various components. You'll see, and I know this might be a little bit small on your screen, but you'll see in this table there's a list of what your activity is and whether or not what your requirement could be in terms of licensing, preventive controls, written PCPs, and traceability. So this is just a little table that tells you about that. But in essence, January 15th, 2019 is coming. And for many in the industry, they're going to have to be compliant at that time. And that means, as I said, if you're outside the country, your customers are probably going to have to be compliant. Because, for example, you'll see retail says January 15th, 2020. However, if you are a retailer and you import, which most of the big ones, well, I think all the big ones do, your compliance date for traceability requirements is January 15th, 2019. So clock is ticking for everybody, or for most, I should say. And last, but certainly not least, Jeff talked about some of the tools. I'm just pointing this one out to you. This is kind of a decision tree type of tool that you can step through. You can go on the website, CFIA resources, and step yourself through that and find out what you need to do and what your timelines are based on your part of the business. And again, I would just, I think, reiterate, Jeff, I believe also mentioned, Ask CFIA is a resource that's been set up by CFIA to answer any questions about these new regulations. And it, again, is available on the CFIA website. And I would really encourage you, if you have questions that you think only the government can answer, use that tool, and they have it set up quite well. So they'll let you know when you're going to hear back. They'll give you a number for your inquiry, et cetera, and it should work quite well. And that is it from me.
Thank you for that, Jane. And on screen you'll see the contact details for our presenters. And this slide shows some of the references that were used within the presentation. And I'd like to give another thank you to our presenters today for a wonderful job, Jane, Jeff and Todd. And thank you all for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you again on another RedLine Solutions webinar.